truth is always stranger than fiction. This is Stranger Than Fiction with Robert Homrich.
Hello and welcome to the very first installment of the strangest hour on the internet, Stranger Than Fiction. Here we will explore all things esoteric, occult, conspiracy related, and things that are otherwise, well, stranger than fiction, just as the name would suggest. Hello everyone, I'm your host Robert Homrich, and to kick this series off I'm going to be dedicating this entire first episode to introducing myself, and to sharing my own personal stranger than fiction story with you. But before we can start getting into all that, I just want to go over a couple things. For starters, I want you to know that, at least at this point, this show is really just an experiment. And much of the show's longevity is going to depend on the response from viewers like you. So if you like what you see here, and you find this information to be useful, please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and all that good stuff. Now the second thing I want you to understand is that the most important rule to remember here on Stranger Than Fiction is simply that there are no rules. So I don't want you getting too used to seeing any one particular format on this show. If I may quote the late great Roddy Piper, just when you think you have all the answers, I'll change the questions. So while on one week I may be giving a presentation or a lecture, the following week I may be covering a world event, interviewing a special guest, or something along those lines. So bearing all that in mind, let's get this ball rolling, and please allow me to share some of my story with you. My story begins in October of 2000 when I lost all of my vital signs while being rushed to the emergency room by ambulance due to complications from asthma. Now, some people might call what I had a near-death experience, although I think this terminology is flawed as there was nothing near about my experience. For all intents and purposes, I was clinically dead. I personally think it's better use of the terminology to say that I had an out-of-body experience. But in any event, it was during that experience that I was guided by a presence much greater than my own to download, if you will, information directly from the pages of the Book of Thoth. Of course, at that point in my life, I really had no idea what the Book of Thoth even was, but that's kind of irrelevant. Now, there's no way for me to truly describe what I experienced during that encounter. The best I can do to describe it is to say, imagine being struck by a lightning bolt, containing every single thought ever conceived, by every single being to have ever lived, and all in a single, yet eternal, instant. And then, and only then, can you even begin to get an idea of where I'm actually coming from here. Now, obviously the fact that I'm here today telling you this story tells you that I didn't remain in that state, and that the emergency room's medical staff was able to restore my vital signs, and I returned to the land of the living. But not before I spent the next several days intubated in a medically induced coma at the hospital's intensive care unit. Awakening from that coma was a whole other experience in itself. For starters, my brain was completely fried. My stomach and legs had atrophy, so I couldn't walk or eat food. But the worst part of it all was simply in knowing that I just had this amazing experience. And during that experience, every last bit of this information I was downloading had made perfect, beautiful, eloquent, harmonious sense. But meanwhile, back in the train wreck that was my physical body, the downloaded information had become jarbled and scrambled, almost as if it had been encrypted or something. So basically, I felt like I had just been given the secrets to the greatest mysteries of humanity, and then I promptly had my memory wiped away clean by the men in black with their little flashlight pen. The memories weren't actually gone so much as they were just encoded, and I felt like it was up to me to decode them, but now, if only I could remember what it was that I was supposed to decode. So, in that sense, it kind of created a paradox for me, if you can imagine. So anyways, after that, I decided it was time to do some serious soul-searching, although it would be another 12 years before I made any real progress in my search for my soul, let alone any progress in decoding some of these great mysteries, but ironically enough, the two actually kind of go hand in hand. You see, it was late in 2012 when I happened upon a film by Scott Onstott on YouTube called Secrets in Plain Sight. The film's a compilation of Scott's own research and the research of others. It's almost 4 hours long, and it's densely loaded with mind-blowing facts about the secrets that are hidden all around us in plain sight within great works of art, architecture, and more. In fact, next week I'm actually going to have Scott here on the show as a guest, and we're going to talk all about his film and more, so I'm really looking forward to that. Make sure you check it out. But anyways, as I watched the film's first segment, which focuses in on the secret design of Washington, D.C., I started to realize that there were some very important key pieces of the puzzle that were missing, And even more importantly, I felt like I knew exactly what these pieces were and how they all fit together to tell a cohesive story that's so eloquently profound on a multitude of different levels that you simply must see it in order to believe it. But needless to say, by watching Scott's film, I had finally begun decoding some of the encrypted information that I had downloaded during my out-of-body experience 12 years earlier. It was about the equivalent of waking up one day and realizing that you're actually fluent in a language that you've never even studied. And ironically enough, the date that this finally occurred was etched in stone thousands of years prior by the Mayan culture, as it was precisely on the winter solstice, December 21st, 2012, that I finally began putting the pieces of this puzzle together and things finally began to click for me. Now, of course, that fateful day also coincides with the end of the Mayan long count calendar, which many people have said pointed to the date of the Great Apocalypse. While brimstone and fire most certainly failed to rain down upon the earth on that fateful day, an apocalypse of sorts did indeed occur when considered in the context that the word apocalypse, in its truest and most original context, quite literally means an unveiling or disclosing of hidden knowledge. And just as this hidden knowledge was unveiled to me, I unveiled it to the world the following year in the form of a large-scale, highly detailed, and incredibly thought-provoking work of art that I had spent the previous 8 months meticulously laboring over. Now let me tell you a little secret about this artwork that I created. It actually undeniably reveals the long-speculated and highly debated secret design of Washington, D.C. in full stunning detail. I unveiled the 10-foot by 10-foot artwork to an overwhelming response from the general public in September of 2013 at Art Prize, which is held each year in my own hometown of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and is allegedly the world's largest annual art competition. Now, I'm going to show you the artwork that I created here in a moment, but I don't want to spoil the surprise for those who aren't already aware, so for now, let's just say that the artwork was controversial, to say the least. Now, to make a long story short, the artwork was so controversial that it was very quickly and covertly blacklisted from the competition, to the point where I returned the following year as a rogue, unregistered entry, and I destroyed that same artwork along with the credibility of Art Prize, right there in the center of the town square in public protest to the discreet censorship of Art Prize, which, along with already having a prior and established history of censoring controversial artists, it really only served to further weaken the already damaged reputation of the alleged competition. Now, while my artwork was covertly blacklisted from the competition, they couldn't stop the word about my presentation from spreading, and ultimately, it was the overwhelming response that I received from the general public that prompted me to write a book. And today I'm going to share with you some of the details of that book. Now, first things first, the book is called The Vitruvian Code, The Secret Anatomy of Washington, D.C. and Its Connections to the Ancient Mysteries. And you can pick up a copy on Amazon.com or by visiting the official Vitruvian Code website at www.thevitruviancode.com. And I strongly urge you to do that because the book contains so much more details than I could ever properly cover within the limited time frame of this presentation. But today I am going to attempt to give you a brief rundown of the secret code that they claim does not exist within the layout of Washington, D.C., how it all fits together, and what it all means for you and me. But before we can get too deep into my own personal revelations about the secret design of Washington, D.C., we're going to need to go over to a couple of things that were already fairly well known, at least by some, about the city's design, starting with some of the most obvious. Now, the first thing you need to understand about Washington, D.C. is that the city was built by Freemasons, and it was designed under the direct supervision of President George Washington, who, as we all know, was a well-known and high-ranking Freemason. Now, if you ask any qualified conspiracy theorist about the secret design of Washington, D.C., they will almost always instinctually point directly to two things first, those being the infamous inverted pentagram, which is located just north of the White House, and the other being the set of Masonic compasses, which are located just outside of the United States Capitol building, as you can clearly see highlighted on this map. Of course, there are other anomalies that occur within the city's design, which are fairly easy to spot, such as the owl, who many equate with Moloch, and of course there's other stuff as well that we're going to get to in due time, along with the Masonic compasses. But for right now, I just want to focus in on the inverted pentagram. Now, at the southernmost point of this inverted pentagram, you're going to find the location of the White House. And of course, because the pentagram is inverted, many people naturally equate this symbol to have some sort of a satanic purpose in Washington, D.C. But if you actually do your research, you're going to discover that the inverted pentagram wasn't adopted into Satanism until the latter half of the 20th century, which was long after the groundwork for Washington, D.C. had already been laid. Now, you're probably also going to notice that the pentagram in Washington, D.C. is not completed. It's actually missing one of its 15 segments. And for this reason, many researchers cite the play by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe called Faust, where a poorly constructed pentagram allows Mephistopheles, or the devil, to enter a room, but then it prevents him from leaving by the same way. But again, if you do your research, you're going to discover that this play was first published in 1808, which again was several years after the groundwork for Washington, D.C. had already been laid, so it could not have been the inspiration for the pentagram's inclusion in the city's design. However, that's not to say that the play and the design of Washington, D.C. weren't both inspired by the same occult magic practices, to which the pentagram has long been a utilized symbol or tool. In fact, in some occult magic practices, a broken pentagram can represent a dimensional gate or a portal for which spirits such as demons can pass through. Now, before we move on, I just want to go over some of the research of David Oveson from his book, The Secret Architecture of Our Nation's Capital, The Masons and the Building of Washington, D.C. His research notes that the cornerstones for all of the most prominent landmark buildings and monuments in Washington, D.C. were all laid in Masonic ceremonies that all correlated with the sun's alignment to the stellar constellation Virgo. His book also notes over 1,000 zodiacal references to the constellation Virgo, which are incorporated into the city's statues, monuments, art, and architecture. In addition, his book notes that even the Federal Triangle itself was designed to reflect the stellar constellation's three brightest stars, Regulus, Arcturus, and Spica. This all stems from the ancient philosophical principle of Hermeticism, as above, so below, which is to say that everything that happens on any level of reality, be it physical, mental, or spiritual, also happens on every other level. The immortal words are accredited to the ancient philosopher Hermes Trismegistus, who was synonymous with Enoch, and is said to have taught man the craft of building cities and temples in alignment with the stars, in order to channel and harness the cosmic energies associated with the gods and goddesses that the heavenly bodies represent, such as the Virgin Goddess in this particular case. Now, perhaps this is the reason our forefathers chose to place our nation's capital between Virginia and Maryland, or in other words, between Virgin and Mary. But what's interesting about the three brightest stars of Virgo is that they actually make up what is known in geometry as a Pythagorean triangle, or the mathematical equation that you're probably more familiar with, which is simply a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Now, we can go into the mathematics and geometry of this equation all day long, but it's really not important. The important thing you need to understand for this presentation is that the Pythagorean triangle carries with it a very special meaning in Freemasonry, as the triangle's two smaller sides are said to represent the divine masculine and the divine feminine, and the hypotenuse, or the longer line, representing the union of the two through their offspring. So, perhaps this is why we have a recurring theme of the allegorical male and female figures flanking an exalted figure in the middle, like we find in so many statues and structures in Washington, D.C., such as with the United States Supreme Court building, the James Buchanan Monument, and don't even get me started on the Boy Scouts Memorial. I mean, there's so much symbolism going on here, I could do a whole show on just that. But perhaps this is why we have a statue called Destiny, who is forever gazing out on the hypotenuse of Washington, D.C., which we commonly know as Pennsylvania Avenue, from the top of the pediment at the National Archives building, while being flanked on the ground by these same allegorical male and female figures. But another recurring theme in Washington, D.C. is sacred geometry. A number of figures from sacred geometry have been observed within the city's design, including the Flower of Life, the Tree of Life, and Metatron's Cube. Now, to fully grasp why these symbols appear in the city's design, I'm going to need to give you a little crash course in sacred geometry, so here we go. The flower of life is a symbol of sacred geometry that is said to depict ancient spiritual beliefs, the fundamental aspects of time and space, and even the 7 days of creation. However, in order to have a flower, you must first have a seed. According to sacred geometry, the first step in building the seed of life was the creation of the octahedron by a divine creator, or God. The next step in building the seed of life was for the creator to spin the octahedron on its axis, and in this way, a circle or sphere was formed, depending on whether you're using a 2D model or a 3D model. With this circle or sphere, creation began on the first day with the creation of the Vesica Pisces. The Vesica Pisces is formed from two intersecting circles of the same diameter, where the center of each circle is on the circumference of the opposite circle. It is said that the Creator's consciousness began inside the first circle and journeyed to the furthest edge where it formed the second circle. Now on the second day, the triquetra, or the tripod of life, is formed from a third circle being added to the Vesica Pisces, with its center point located at the intersection of the first two circle circumferences, followed by one circle added for each subsequent day until all 7 circles construct the seed of life on the 6th day of creation. Now, of course, on the 7th day, the Creator rested. However, the seed of life took root and began to multiply, and from that came the flower of life, and with it the egg of life, the tree of life, the fruit of life, and Metatron's cube. The flower of life consists of 7 or more overlapping circles, in which the center of each circle is on the circumference of up to 6 surrounding circles of the same diameter, forming a flower-like pattern with the symmetrical structure of a hexagon. This process can be repeated with as many circles as desired, and or the surrounding circles need not be clearly or completely depicted. The symbol predates ancient Egypt and has been found in various cultures throughout history. Many symbols can be found within the Flower of Life's design, with each one believed to possess its own significant meaning. The egg of life is composed of 7 circles taken from the flower of life, resembling the shape of a multicellular embryo in its first hours of creation. From the flower of life comes the tree of life. The tree of life is a common motif in various world theologies, mythologies, and philosophies, but is most widely recognized as a concept within the Kabbalah, which is used as a metaphor to understand the nature of God and the manner in which he created the world ex nihilo, meaning out of nothing. Sometimes called the 10 Sephiro, the tree of life visually and conceptually represents the nature of revealed divinity, the human soul, and the spiritual path of ascent by man. It alludes to the interconnection of all life on our planet and serves as a powerful metaphor for the common descent in the evolutionary sense. The flower of life also bears the fruit of life, which is composed of 13 circles. The fruit of life is said to be the blueprint of the universe, containing the basis for the design of every atom, molecular structure, life form, and everything in existence. If you connect the center of each circle with straight lines extending out to the centers of each of the other 12 circles, you get the geometric figure known as Metatron's cube. And from Metatron's cube, we can derive each of the 5 Platonic solids. Basically, a Platonic solid is a 3-dimensional shape that is made up from multiple faces of the same 2-dimensional geometric figure with equally sized edges, such as a square or a pentagon. Now, we can find a perfect example of the 5 Platonic solids by examining the dice used in the fantasy role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons. The 4, 6, 8, 12, and 20-sided dice are all examples of the 5 Platonic solids, with the 10-sided die not meeting the criteria of a Platonic solid because its edges are not of equal lengths. They are named for the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, who theorized in his dialogue, the Timaeus, that the classical elements were made of these regular solids, with each solid being associated with intuitive justification to an element. Earth was associated with the hexahedron, or the cube, because the cube was believed to cause the solidarity of the earth. Air was associated with the octahedron because its minuscule components were so smooth that one could barely feel it. Water was associated with the icosahedron because it flows out of one's hands when picked up as if it were made of tiny little balls. Fire was associated with the tetrahedron because its heat is sharp and stabbing. And according to Plato, the fifth element, the dodecahedron, was used for arranging the constellations on the whole heaven. Now that you know this, are you seeing a pattern yet? Well, if you're not, let me help you out. The flower of life, the tree of life, Metatron's cube, the Platonic solids, and all of this sacred geometry are all recurring themes of geometric representations for the basic building blocks of life and everything in the universe. Now remember that because it's going to come into play later, but it's because of philosophical concepts like these that the Freemasons reference the Creator with the letter G that sometimes accompanies the square and compass in their symbolism, which is said to represent many things, including grand geometrician or the great architect of the universe, or sometimes even simply as God or geometry. And speaking of the square and compasses, let's move on to their purpose in the secret design of Washington, D.C., and this is where my own personal research starts to come into play. Now, if you ask a Freemason about the meaning of the square and compasses in Freemasonry, you're going to likely get the same old tired exoteric explanation, which is simply that the square reminds them to keep their actions with their fellow man square, and the compasses remind them to circumscribe their lives with the principles of Freemasonry, or some other bullshit along those lines. But the true answer is right there in the open for anybody with the eyes to see, and that is simply that these are the two drafting tools which are required in order to solve the ancient mathematical riddle known as squaring the circle. And it has long been known by the select few that squaring the circle is actually the secret to obtaining perfect geometrical proportions, just like the proportions we find in Leonardo da Vinci's famous drawing, The Vitruvian Man, and in the proportions of the Great Pyramid, both of which are world-renowned examples of, quote, perfect geometric proportions which are derived by squaring the circle. Now, what's interesting about the set of Masonic compasses in Washington, D.C., which are made up by Pennsylvania and Maryland avenues, is that these are actually the key to unlocking the entire mystery. And you'll find that we can use this exact same set of compasses to scale the Vitruvian Man, or as I like to call him, V-Man, in perfect harmonious proportion with a map of Washington, D.C. Now, this is done by measuring the encompass length of 12th Street, and then using that measurement to scale 1/4 or 1 cubit of the Vitruvian Man's height, as indicated by the horizontal lines over his chest, waist, and knees. Now, once we have him in his proper scale, V-Man can be positioned on the map by dissecting Logan and DuPont circles in Washington, D.C., with the line above his head or the top part of the square. And then we simply center the drawing on 16th Street with the White House. Now, with V-Man in his proper proportions on a map of Washington, D.C., we are confronted with an astonishing number of alignments and synchronicities. For starters, you'll notice that his head, face, and chest are all perfectly framed by the city streets. He has ribs, a stomach, and even arteries in his legs. The angles of his arms perfectly mimic the angles of Pennsylvania and New York avenues. But most importantly, you'll also notice that virtually every single angled avenue in the city now points directly to key locations of the V-Man's anatomy. These key locations represent the chakra system of the human anatomy in Washington, D.C. A chakra system contains the 7 major energy points of the subtle, non-physical body, which are arranged vertically along the axial channel. Each individual chakra is typically associated with a particular organ or body function. The chakra system in Washington, D.C. serves to literally charge the city and its structures with the energies associated with each relative chakra, exemplifying the ancient Hermetic principle, as above, so below. In Washington, D.C., the Jefferson Memorial represents the root chakra, Muladhara, which is typically located at the base of the spine and is associated with the adrena medulla, which is responsible for the flight or fight response when survival is under threat. Above that, the Washington Monument represents the sacral chakra, Svadhisthana. The Washington Monument contains a lot of clues for solving this mystery, so before we proceed to any further chakras, let's explore the site just a little bit more. Of course, the true center of Washington, D.C. is technically located at the United States Capitol building, but one could reasonably argue that the true central focal point of the city is actually on the Washington Monument. It's strategically located between 4 of the city's most prominent structures, and the obelisk dominates an otherwise relatively flat landscape. Now you'll notice on the map that this chakra is a little bit off-centered, and this is because, as we all know from President Trump, Washington, D.C. was built over a swamp that's in desperate need of being drained. And it's because of this, the originally intended location for the Washington Monument turned out to be located on marshlands which wouldn't actually support the weight of the structure, so its location had to be repositioned, and they chose to shift it slightly to the southeast. Now, for anybody interested, the originally intended location for the Washington Monument today is marked by the Jefferson Pier Stone in Washington, D.C. So if you go and look that up, you'll find out where the Washington Monument was supposed to have been. And if you do that, you'll see that it would have lined up perfectly with the chakra system. And while it's not lined up perfectly, it is still the centerpiece of the National Mall, which is still located between the Capitol Building and the Lincoln Memorial, and it still lies equidistant between the White House and the Jefferson Memorial. And of course, this begs to ask the question of why the forefathers would choose to center their capital city around an obelisk, which is an ancient Egyptian symbol, when the United States has no real ties to ancient Egypt. And of course, we've all heard the jokes that the Washington Monument is said to represent a giant penis, but believe it or not, that's not really a joke at all. According to the Masonic Dictionary, the word obelisk literally means Baal's shaft, or Baal's organ of reproduction. And of course, this all stems from the ancient legend of Osiris. And for those who aren't aware, Osiris was an Egyptian god who was murdered by his jealous brother Set. And according to the legend, after murdering Osiris, Set cut his body into several pieces and buried them throughout the land of Egypt, all except for his phallus, which he threw into the sea, and it was subsequently eaten by a fish. Then along came Osiris' sister bride, Isis, who managed to retrieve the body parts and resurrect Osiris. But because she wasn't able to retrieve the phallus, she fashioned him a new one out of pure gold, and it was with that the two immaculately conceived their miracle godchild, Horus. Long before the Bible, the legend of Osiris is the original story of resurrection, sibling rivalry, wrestling with gods, and immaculate conception, which are all principles which were adopted later by Christianity. In fact, the sun god Horus was the original Jesus and the first recorded case of identity theft. Now, what's interesting here, I find this interesting, is that some legends say that Set had cut Osiris's body into 14 pieces. And if you actually count the divided sections of V-Man, you're going to count 13 sections, plus his phallus, which equals 14 body parts. While the Washington Monument has its share of masculine energy, that's not to say that the monument is completely without its share of feminine energy. In fact, the pathways that surround the Washington Monument make up a pattern which is known in geometry as the Vesica Pisces. The name Vesica Pisces literally means the bladder of a fish because of its shape. Now, you remember how Osiris's phallus was eaten by a fish? Well, not just any fish, but a Jesus fish at that. Well, where I'm from, we have a saying, and it's, if it smells like cologne, leave it alone, but if it smells like fish, it's a good dish. And I guess what I'm really trying to say in my own profound, eloquent, unique little way is simply that if you do your research, you're going to learn that the Vesica Pisces is, in fact, a symbol for a woman's vagina. You simply can't make this stuff up, folks. The capital of the United States is built around a 555-foot tall, rock-hard granite penis, which is resting comfortably inside a vagina. And of course, once you know all this, it should come as no surprise that the sacral chakra is typically associated with the reproductive organs. Now I'd like to draw your attention to this image from Scott Onstott's film Secrets in Plain Sight. It shows how the Vesica Pisces provides the link that reveals the Great Pyramid and the Washington Monument's perfect proportional relations to one another, with the Great Pyramid's base and apex converging with the Vesica Pisces where the two circles intersect. The Washington Monument's proportional height is equal to the diameter of either of the two circles. But these perfectly proportional geometric relationships are not the only link between the Great Pyramid and the Federal City. And we can find another link at dcsymbols.com, which shows us that certain aspects of the Great Pyramid's cross-section view can be found within the design of Washington, D.C. And that's because the Great Pyramid is actually the next piece to solving this puzzle. And if you scale a diagram of the Great Pyramid square and circle to the same size as V-Man's square and circle and place it on the map with the top of the circle at the top of V-Man's head, again we are confronted with some even more astonishing alignments. For starters, the Great Pyramid points directly to every single wound suffered by Christ during the crucifixion. The pyramid's 4 vent shafts point to 4 stars in the sky, indicating 4 nail wounds. The roof of the King's Chamber coincides with the Roosevelt Memorial Bridge, pointing to where the fatal Roman spear, or the spear of destiny, if you will, pierced Christ's ribs. And of course, the missing capstone represents the crown of thorns that was worn by Christ. But what's most interesting is that this also places the Queen's Chamber directly over the V-Man's phallus, which is symbolic of sexual union, just as the nearby obelisk resting in a Vesica Piscis represents in Washington, D.C. The symbolism literally echoes, especially when you consider that V-Man himself is resting inside a much larger Vesica Piscis, as is a triangle which, if you've ever seen or read the Da Vinci Code, you will know that an upwards pointing triangle is also a symbol of a phallus. You might even say that that phallus has been circumcised. So if you ever wonder why the Catholic Church got into such a fuss over Dan Brown's fictional novel, which tells the tale of the secrets of the true bloodline of Christ being encoded into the artwork of Leonardo da Vinci and great works of architecture, perhaps you will now have a much better understanding as to why this truly is. But the thing that I personally find most interesting about all of this is that each time you add a new layer to this secret code, it not only echoes a particular symbolism, but the overall image itself visually depicts that very same symbolism. And with the addition of the Great Pyramid, the image even visually resembles Christ on and ascending from the cross. Now, it has long been known that the Great Pyramid's vent shafts point to 4 distinct stars in the sky. Descending from these 4 stars, within the greater diagram of Washington, D.C., we find 2 highways, which are Interstate 66 and Interstate 395, which both represent opposing bloodlines, which both funnel down into the bottomless pit of the Great Pyramid. Now, to the west of Washington, D.C., we have the pyramid's 2 southern stars, Alnitak, which is a star in Orion's belt, and of course Orion is closely associated with the Egyptian god Osiris. And then there's Sirius, which is a star that is closely associated with his counterpart Isis, and there's no coincidence there. And it should be noted that the star Sirius plays a very important role in Freemasonry, as well as this star is equated with being the Star of Bethlehem, because it's the brightest star in the sky. It appears in the east in the holidays, and so the 3 wise men followed the brightest star. Of course, those 3 wise men are the 3 belt stars of Orion, and we could go down that one too, but it's not really necessary for this presentation. In fact, Pennsylvania Avenue is actually aligned to the heliacal rising of Sirius. And even more, the Egyptian hieroglyph for Sirius is actually represented by 3 symbols that are prominently featured at each of the 3 corners of the Pythagorean triangle of the Federal Triangle. And of course, those 3 symbols are a 5-pointed star, represented by the broken inverted pentagram of Washington, D.C., a semicircle or dome, as represented by the Capitol building, and an oblong triangle or an obelisk, which is obviously represented by the Washington Monument. But I'm getting a little off track, so let's get back to these bloodlines. The Interstate 66 bloodline to the west could be interpreted as the bloodline of Osiris and Isis, or it could also be interpreted by its newer version, the bloodline of Christ and Mary Magdalene, but either way, it's the same old story. In either case, this bloodline merges from 2 into 1 at the Lincoln Memorial and travels down river and then funnels itself into the bottomless pit inside the Great Pyramid. Now, opposing Interstate 66 to the east is Interstate 395, which is represented by the stars Kochab and Thuban. And this is where it gets a little bit interesting, because the name Kochab literally means waiting him who cometh, which represents the Antichrist, while Thuban literally means the head of the serpent, which is an obvious reference to Satan. Okay? Now, like its counterpart, the bloodline of Interstate 395 also funnels into the bottomless pit. But with this bloodline, the two do not merge into one. Okay? So here we have two bloodlines, one representing the bloodline of Christ and one representing the bloodline of the Antichrist. And if there's any doubt, just look between V-Man's lower left hand and you're going to find the number 666 encoded right there into the landscape of Washington, D.C., right over the spot that this artery of 395, this artery, if you will, emerges from an underground tunnel. At least that's what you would find if you looked there before I released my book. However, since releasing that book, this site has mysteriously gone under construction and it has been obscured on current Google Earth images. And I can't help but wonder if they are attempting to hide or change the appearance of this location now because it got exposed in my book, but I digress. The most important thing you need to understand about these bloodlines is that they represent an allegory for principles which exist within each and every person. And that's right, I'm going to say it again. These bloodlines represent Christ and the Antichrist, which are really simply allegories for principles that exist within us all. And that's something that's very important for you need to understand. But anyways, let's continue to make our way up the chakra system and see what else we can discover. Now, above the Washington Monument is the Washington Ellipse, representing Manipura, the navel or solar plexus chakra. There's not a whole lot going on here except to say that by now you're probably a lot closer to understanding that this doesn't really represent V-Man's stomach at all. It's actually his and her womb. Next we have the White House resting squarely on V-Man's sternum, representing Anahata, the heart chakra, or even the heart of the city. As above, so below, the White House represents the microcosm to the macrocosm of Washington, D.C., and thus we find its proportions also conform to the proportions of V-Man, and thus into the design template of Washington, D.C. itself. Now, as the microcosm to the macrocosm, the White House reflects Washington, D.C., and so V-Man's actually inverted with his head to the south because it's a reflection. Also reflected in the White House is the Pythagorean triangle. By connecting the center points of each of the three main bedrooms at the White House, which are a very masculine bedroom in the Lincoln bedroom, a very feminine bedroom in the Queen's bedroom, and of course there's a room for their divine offspring, which would be the President's bedroom, we have a perfect reflection of the federal triangle in Washington, D.C. But to decode the White House, you really need to look at it from a three-dimensional perspective, with the diplomatic reception room on the ground floor representing V-Man's head. And 3 floors above that, at the highest floor in the White House, which is actually elevated slightly higher than all of the other rooms on the 3rd floor, we find the solarium, or the sun room, which is a great high place to pay homage to and receive light from your sun god, Horus, if you follow me. Now, located on the floors between V-Man's head and the sunroom above are 4 color-coded rooms, and I do mean coded when I say coded rooms. On the 1st floor, above the oval-shaped diplomatic reception room, we have the blue oval room, flanked on either side by the red room and the green room. And on the 2nd floor above the blue oval room, we have the yellow oval room. And in order to decode the colored rooms of the White House, we must find out what these 4 colors actually have in common. And in order to do that, we must consider a theory known as opponent process theory. It really has nothing to do with the White House, at least not directly, but rather it has to do with the way our eyes perceive color. If you place the color spectrum on a wheel, you're going to find that each color gradually transitions from one to the next around the entire wheel. However, directly opposing one another on this wheel are 2 sets of colors that do not transition into one another, with red opposing green and yellow opposing blue. You see, red, green, and yellow, blue are the so-called forbidden colors. They're composed of pairs of hues whose light frequencies automatically cancel each other out in the human eye. they're supposed to be impossible to see simultaneously. You see, cells in the retina called opponent neurons fire when stimulated by incoming red light, and this flurry of activity tells the brain that we're actually looking at something red. But those same sets of opponent neurons are inhibited by green light, and the absence of activity tells the brain we're seeing something green. And similarly, yellow light excites another set of opponent neurons while blue light damps them. While most colors induce a mixture of effects in both sets of neurons, which our brains can decode to identify the component parts, red light exactly cancels the effect of green light, and yellow exactly cancels blue, so we can never really perceive those colors coming from the same place. And for a demonstration of opponent process theory at work, I'll ask you to simply focus your eyes on the white dot at the center of this oddly colored image of an American flag for a moment. Now, when properly executed, you should catch a quickly fading glimpse of the American flag displayed with its proper colors. But it should also be noted that this effect will not work if you're colorblind. But in the White House, the red room directly opposes the green room on the first floor, and the blue oval room directly opposes the yellow oval room between the first and second floors. Now, is it possible that these color-coded rooms were crossed to symbolically represent the so-called forbidden colors? Is it possible that the forbidden colors were strategically placed between the sunlight or the solarium and the Vitruvian man's head, the diplomatic reception room, as a symbolic gesture to making something invisible to the naked eye, but not invisible to the illuminated third eye above the head, located in the sun rays of the diplomatic reception room's vestibule? As was previously mentioned, the visual depiction further echoes this same symbolism with the addition of the White House floor plans into the greater diagram of Washington, D.C. And now, the diplomatic reception room, with its surrounding rooms and vestibule, takes on the visual appearance of the sun and its rays framing V-Man with his face. Now, one can't help but think of the numerous biblical passages noting a face that shines like a sun. The next chakra, Vishuddha, which should be located around the area of 16th Street and K Street, is conspicuously absent in Washington, D.C. because of its association with the throat and communication. And of course, this is done so in order to maintain discretion and secrecy. Above that, Scott's circle takes on the geometric form of the Star of David, representing Ajna, or the third eye chakra, which is linked to the pineal gland. Scott's circle also represents the hidden Sephiro called Da'at, or Da'ath, from the Kabbalistic Tree of Life in Washington, D.C., and it is at this location in D.C. that 16th Street is redirected through a short underground tunnel. Now, there's no real reason for this underground passage except for symbolically because it's literally representing the hidden pathway on the Tree of Life. Now, Da'at or Da'ath means gnosis or knowledge, which brings us to the occult. And the word occult literally means knowledge of the hidden. And in the context of occult magic, the combined images of Washington, D.C., the Vitruvian Man, the Great Pyramid, and the White House floor plans bear a remarkable number of similarities consistent with sigil magic, or magic circles as they are sometimes called. A sigil, from the Latin word sigillum, meaning seal, is a symbol used in magic. The term has usually referred to a type of pictorial signature of a demon or other entity, but in modern usage, especially in the context of chaos magic, it refers to a symbolic representation of the magician's desired outcome. A magic circle is a circle or sphere of space marked out by practitioners of many branches of ritual magic, which they generally believe will contain energy and form a sacred space, or provide them with a form of magical protection, or both. It may be marked out physically, drawn in salt or chalk, for example, or merely visualized. Its spiritual significance is similar to that of the mandala or yantra in some Eastern religions. And there are many published techniques for casting a circle, and many groups and individuals have their own unique methods, but the common feature of these practices is that the boundary is traced around a working area. Some witchcraft traditions say that one must trace around the circle deosil 3 times. There's some variation over which direction one should start. Circles may or may not be physically marked out on the ground, and a variety of elaborate patterns for circle markings can be found in grimoires and magical manuals, often involving angelic and divine names. Such markings, or a simple unadorned circle, may be drawn in chalk or salt, or indicated by other means such as with a cord. The 4 cardinal directions are often prominently marked, such as with 4 candles. In ceremonial magic traditions, the 4 directions are commonly related to the 4 archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel or Oriel, or the 4 classical elements, and also have 4 associated names of God. Other ceremonial traditions have candles between the quarters, that is, the northeast, the northwest, and so on. Often, an incantation will be recited stating the purpose and nature of the circle, often repeating an assortment of divine and angelic names. And of course, one of the most widely known examples of a magic circle is called the Sigillum Dei Aemeth, meaning the seal of God's truth, although it is sometimes simply referred to as the Sigillum Dei, meaning the seal of God. The Sigillum Dei Aemeth is most widely known through the writings and artifacts of John Dee, who was a 16th century occultist and astrologer in the court of Elizabeth I. The Sigillum Dei is composed of 2 circles, a pentagram, and 3 heptagons, and is labeled with the name of God and his angels. It was an amulet with a magical function that, according to one of its oldest sources, Liber Ieritus, allowed the initiated magician to have power over all creatures except archangels, but is usually only reserved for those who can achieve the blessed vision of God and the angels. Now, in terms of pure geometry, there is a remarkable synchronicity when proportioning the Sigillum Dei over Vitruvian Man's circle within the greater diagram of Washington, D.C. The 7 points of the sigil's heptagram neatly harmonize with the geometry of the greater diagram. 4 of the heptagram's points fall on the Vitruvian Man's outstretched arms and legs as defined by the circle, and the 3 remaining points perfectly mimic the angles of the Great Pyramid's slopes, as if to lock it all together. In fact, these combined images contain all of the components associated with a typical magic circle. The circle deosil is traced out 3 times with the Vitruvian Man, the Great Pyramid, and the Sigillum Dei. The cardinal directions are clearly marked with the White House to the north, the Jefferson Memorial to the south, the Capitol Building to the east, and the Lincoln Memorial to the west, and of course the Washington Monument acting as the compass needle in the center. We have the 4 elements, which are represented by the Platonic solids as derived from Metatron's cube, along with the flower of life, the Kabbalistic tree of life, and all the sacred geometry that we went through earlier. And of course, the repetition of angelic names is represented with a magic amulet that is said to have power over all creatures except archangels. In fact, the Sigillum Dei is a cipher to actually decode the 72 names of God and the names of the archangels. Remarkably, with the addition of the Sigillum Dei Aemeth, the 7-pointed heptagram perfectly frames the Great Pyramid as a visual and symbolic representation of the complete restoration of the pyramid and its missing capstone, or the restoration of our true connection to the divine, while simultaneously placing a crown upon the Vitruvian Man's head. In addition, the combined images of the greater diagram of Washington, D.C. even take on the visual appearance of a sealed envelope or a scroll which has been broken. Could these combined images actually be a visual representation of the desired outcome of an occult magic spell that has been cast over Washington, D.C.? At the very top of Washington, D.C.'s chakra system is the location of the House of the Temple, which is the national headquarters of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry Southern Jurisdiction. Surrounding the upper portions of the temple's exterior facades are 33 columns, each 33 feet in height, representing the 33 degrees of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, as presided over by its Supreme Council of 33 members of 33rd degree Masons. Its location at 1733 16th Street was deliberately placed out of numeric sequence with the rest of the design template of Washington, D.C., so that the address would contain the number 33. Now, there's a lot of theories that attempt to explain the Freemasons' obsession with the number 33. And of course, the most logical explanation is simply that the number represents the 33 states of the southern jurisdiction that are presided over by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite. Although there are many who believe that the number holds a much deeper meaning, referring to the 33 vertebrae of the human spinal column. In fact, at the very heart of nearly all the symbolism of Washington, D.C., as well as in nearly all occult symbolism, period, anywhere, you're going to find multiple connections with the human anatomy, but we'll get to that in a minute. But the building's location does bring up an interesting point, and that is simply that the Masonic lodges are typically, although not always, located in the east in order to resonate with the cosmic energies of the star Sirius. And of course, the House of the Temple goes against this Masonic tradition with its location in the northwestern quadrant of the city. This slight deviation, along with the building's out-of-sequence address, seems to suggest that the Supreme Council might have chosen the temple's precise location in the federal district for a very specific reason. There are many who believe that the specific site was chosen for its symbolic location, which is exactly 13 blocks north of the White House. And the angle of New Hampshire Avenue seems to suggest to some that the House of the Temple was placed in Washington, D.C. to symbolically reflect the all-seeing eye of Providence, or the eye of Horus, positioned above a 13-step or a 13th-street pyramid, much like that which we can find on the back of the U.S. $1 bill, and just as we can now clearly see in the symbolism of the greater diagram of Washington, D.C. Now, a couple of the most important things about the House of the Temple that you really need to understand is that it represents Sahasrara, the crown chakra, which is typically associated with pure divine consciousness, and that the building was modeled after the tomb of King Mausolus at Halicarnassus from the 4th century BCE, which was one of the original 7 wonders of the ancient world. In fact, not only was the House of the Temple modeled after a tomb, but it is itself a tomb, as it is the eternal resting place of the former Sovereign Grand Commander of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, Albert Pike. So here's where you need to ask yourself as to why they would use a crypt as a symbol to represent pure consciousness in Washington, D.C., as if to say that pure consciousness is dead. With that in mind, try taking this image of Washington, D.C. with V-Man and comparing it to an image of an autopsy chart, and you're going to notice a remarkable similarity between the two. And while we're on the subject of temples, I'd like to shift our focus to another temple. Now, it's no secret that the Freemasons claim a direct lineage to the Knights Templar, who got their Templar name from being stationed on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem during the Crusades, which was said to be the location of Solomon's Temple. And of course, we know from the Bible that Solomon's Temple was said to house the Ark of the Covenant until the temple was destroyed in 586 BCE. In his best-selling novel, The Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown popularized an age-old legend claiming that the true purpose for the Knights Templar being stationed on the Temple Mount was actually to retrieve an ancient lost artifact that had went missing around the time of Christ. Now, some people say that it was the Holy Grail the Templars were seeking, and others say it was the Ark of the Covenant. But what if it was all true? What if the Templars found both the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy Grail? And what if they used what they had found as leverage to blackmail the Catholic Church into gaining widespread wealth and power, only to be later retaliated against by the Catholic Church's subsequent and unprecedented prosecution of the Knights Templar, which had forced the order into the underground, only to later re-emerge under the new guise of a secret society known as the Freemasons? By examining ancient texts and manuscripts, such as the Talmud, we now have a really good idea of what Solomon's Temple would have actually looked like in its time, and here's what the floor plans would actually look like. Now let me ask you this. What is a temple as it relates to the human anatomy? Well, some people might say that my temples are on the sides of my head, while others might say, my body is my temple. Well, lo and behold, your body is the temple. Solomon's temple represents the seventh seal of the greater diagram of Washington, D.C., or as I call it, the Vitruvian Code, but you might also know it as the seven seals of the apocalypse. It's just that the apocalypse isn't what you thought it was. None of it is as you thought it was. With Solomon's temple overlaid onto the greater diagram of Washington, D.C., we find a depiction of Jacob literally resting his head upon the foundation stone where he dreamed of a ladder that extended up into the heavens. Well, narrow is the path, and few will find it. Have you ever considered that the Holy Grail is actually inside of you, and that the Ark of the Covenant is all in your head? Because they are. Hence, we find an owl surrounding the United States Capitol building, which has a dome at its top for a reason. But it's on the ceiling beneath this dome that we find the final clue in our mystery, and it's a painting known as the Apotheosis of Washington, where we find George Washington looking down from the heavens above while being exalted amongst a pantheon of mythological gods and goddesses. In fact, the word apotheosis literally means to be elevated to a godlike status. That is to say that the apotheosis occurs beneath the dome of your own skull inside the human mind. Now, in my book, The Vitruvian Code, I present a couple of different possibilities as to why we find all this symbolism so heavily encoded into the landscape of Washington, D.C., and what it all could mean for you and me. But unfortunately, we're running short on time, and I need to bring this presentation to a close. So I'm going to leave you with just one of these possibilities, but it's important for you to remember that there are other possibilities, and that's why it's so important for you to read my book. But in any event, I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts, which are as follows. Have you ever considered that maybe, just maybe, the greatest secret ever kept by these secret societies is actually you? Because it's not really a secret at all. In fact, it's written into the best-selling book of all time. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, verse 20 and 21, we read, quote, "And when he was demanded of the Pharisees when the kingdom of God should come, he," being Jesus, "answered to them and said, The kingdom of God cometh not with observation. Neither shall they say, Lo here or lo there, for behold, the kingdom of God is within you." The book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 26, also confirms that God not only created man in his image and likeness, but he also gave authority to man over all the plants and animals of the earth. One authority that God did not give to man was authority over his fellow man. God was very clear to instruct man to, quote, "love one another as I have loved you," end quote. That is to quite very literally say that we all have the authority of the Most High kingdom of all right within each and every one of us. Imagine having all the authority of the Pope, the Queen of England, the President of the United States, and all other world leaders combined, and much, much more. That's the kind of authority that we're actually talking about here. That is the very real authority that you actually possess, and it rests in something so simple that it's often overlooked, and that's a little something called free will. You possess the authority of free will granted to you by God himself. So then I must ask, why then do you feel the obligation to request permission from lesser authorities called states, which don't even really exist outside of legal fictions, in order to exercise your very real authority to perform such simple tasks as hunting, fishing, and traveling? Have you ever considered that it was actually you that they nailed to a cross? It's time for you to consider the possibility that Washington, D.C. was designed to act as the world's largest voodoo doll, created in the likeness of you, the perfect man or womb man. If Washington, D.C. is in fact designed to reflect a magic circle or sigil, the magician's desired outcome should be pretty clear to most by now. It's to bind you down to a belief system, to brand you as cattle with the mark of the beast, to blind you from receiving the light, and to sever your connection to pure divine consciousness, and to keep you forever waiting him who cometh, while failing to recognize that the true kingdom of God is already within you. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, verse 22, Jesus says, "The light of the body is the eye. Therefore, if thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be filled with light." This is an obvious reference to the chakra system and the third eye. It's time for you to wake up and remember just who it is you really are. You are the sons and daughters of God Himself, and it's time to rebuild your temple. But again, this is really just one possibility, and there are others that are mentioned in my book. And there's still so much more to this mystery that I left out because of time, and that's why you need to order my book, The Vitruvian Code, The Secret Anatomy of Washington, D.C., and its connections to the ancient mysteries on Amazon.com, or by logging on to the official Vitruvian Code website, which is www.thevitruviancode.com, and pick up a copy for yourself. You can also find me and the Vitruvian Code on Facebook, and of course you can find me right here on Stranger Than Fiction next week, where my guest will be Scott Onstadt, and we'll be talking all about his film Secrets in Plain Sight and so much more. So I will see you then. I just want to say thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share. And if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments. I'll try to address them. And otherwise, I will see you next time right here on the strangest hour on the internet, Stranger Than Fiction. See ya.